It's an early morning for you. The breeze coming in off the shoreline is cool and refreshing, but the day is still young enough that the heat hasn't yet tired you out for a mid-afternoon nap. Your chores for the week are done. Your mother is resting comfortably in her space. Since it's such a nice day, you think you'll take some time walking by the shore, by yourself. If only things could work out as planned. On the horizon, you see distant shapes, alien geometry, isolated spires and billowing squares your mind couldn't have conceived of. Tiny figures move over the form like insects, but this nature simile does not offer you any comfort. You feel deep in your heart, in your very spirit, that this is all wrong. And if you were a Taíno person in the late 1400s, you would have been right, because those were the ships of Columbus and his men on the horizon, lost at sea and stranded, and your generosity would soon be rewarded with extreme hostility, enslavement, attempted indoctrination, and likely messy death. And if you were lucky, survival. Hi, I'm Mercedes Acosta. Today I'll be talking about an indigenous approach to cosmic horror. Unlike H.P. Lovecraft and those myriad white folks who came after him to only scratch the surface of spiritual horror, cosmic encroachment, and alien entities, we'll be talking about how the foundation of horror by indigenous people is so often stronger than Lovecraft's work because it isn't built on racism and xenophobia, but rather inevitability. Though my permanent home is the Caribbean, I'm currently speaking to you from ceded, stolen, Chalagüeyiti land, more commonly known as the Cherokee. I'm from the Cuban branch of the Taíno Nation, and I am an initiating practitioner of Sanse Voodoo, Taíno, and Palo religions. I'm a comic artist, kid-lit illustrator, tabletop game designer and illustrator, and general jack of all trades. I made the missing persons horror game What Happened, as well as the environmental horror game Los Arboles. I will speak for approximately an hour or less, all captioned, and then I will come on live to take questions and comments. I would like to extend my deepest gratitude and commendations to Kayla Shaggy, who organized the Indigi-Show, to platform indigenous creatives and compensate each of them in turn. I am a firm believer of compensating people for their time fairly and equitably, and I wouldn't be speaking here today to you if she hadn't worked tirelessly to ensure Indigi-Show is a success. Now, let's talk horror. By now, we've seen plenty of uses of indigenous beliefs, correctly portrayed or not, used in the background of horror stories. Whether it's the ancient Native American burial ground manifesting malignant entities, or beings whose names you're not supposed to say, plenty of horror made without us has danced around any number of indigenous beliefs or legends. This includes cosmic horror. In the tabletop game Call of Cthulhu, one of the pre-existing campaigns features Tlingit folks in reverent awe of elder god artifacts and eldritch anomalies. But so rarely do I see horror that comes from us, that is handled respectfully, that touches upon our beliefs, that touches upon our inevitability, that is handled with some reverence and not just ignorance. I come from a particularly closed culture. Most authorities will tell you the Taíno are extinct, while many claiming to be Taíno online nowadays are liars and fraudsters. We're tight-lipped with our information, and our online presence is minimal for good reason. We were also the first contact Columbus had with the so-called New World. When H.P. Lovecraft speaks of pale, lipless abominations rising from the sea to mate with, sometimes forcibly, and overtake the human race while they worship a cruel, hateful, sleeping god, I'm all too aware that something fairly similar already happened to us. The Caribbean was overtaken by Columbus and the Spanish, and later British, French, and other European powers. We were forced to assimilate to their belief system, taken as wives and husbands and tossed away when our uses were through. We lost a chunk of our culture, and our language even now is sleeping. This is a great way to identify Taíno frauds. If someone is claiming to you that they are a fluent speaker, they are lying. HP's xenophobic fears surrounding immigrants, Black people, and Native people that gave rise to his race of fish people and his other stories had already been played out with us by the same white race Lovecraft belonged to. We had already been overtaken by a strange, alien, malevolent race who worshipped a cruel god of their own egos and sought material gains through cruelty and neglect. H.P. Lovecraft's unsubstantiated fears and nightmares that set the foundation for his popular stories had already played out by white people to us. Events spoken of in prophecies, foretold in the dreams and readings of my ancestors. Suddenly, H.P. Lovecraft doesn't look so groundbreaking and original when you realize indigenous people have been hawking the horror of inevitability and encroachment for years. And yet we fought. We knew it was coming, surely, just like the burning death and rebirth of this planet is coming. And we fought. And survived. Inevitability and ambiguity are some of the best parts of horror, in my opinion. Ambiguity is always something that has appealed to me especially. I'm an intensely curious person, but from a young age it was instilled in me that there would be some questions with no answers. Some things beyond comprehension. Some words that could not be spoken in any language. That didn't stop me from trying to understand, from being excited by the vast sum of knowledge in the universe, but it did teach me early on that some ambiguity in a story is okay. Ambiguity thrives in the horror genre. The idea that we might not ever know what it really was used to powerful degrees of success in the movie It Comes at Night and debatable success in the Blair Witch Project. The first example saw a lot of praise for leaving viewers with a sense of longing, curiosity, and uncertain trepidation, terror because we don't know, and morbid curiosity because what happens if we find out. By contrast, Blair Witch Project has polarizing reviews because many, myself included, feel that it handled the ambiguity so poorly that it came off as ridiculous or nonsensical rather than intentionally mysterious. To me, Blair Witch had a solid premise that it executed very poorly, because by leaving your audience with questions, you can instill a sense of longing, a desire to know, a power that you hold over them that has them come back for more. But you can also irritate people if it just seems willfully abstruse, which is where ambiguity in horror can fail. When I do horror, I go in knowing what I won't know, what my audience won't know. If it's a game, I work out what bits remain mysterious, what parts I don't have to specify, because letting each individual come up with their own horror is that much more effective. The small tweaks I have to make to add the hint of something truly frightening and letting the imagination of my players do the rest. In comics, the use of shadows and empty spaces become wildly effective, and waiting to show any antagonists, and sometimes choosing not to at all, can be a master stroke. In film and television, it's a question unanswered, a villain unrevealed. We know we can't know, and we have to content ourselves with the terror of the unknown. Emily Carroll does it exquisitely in her horror comics, giving the audience enough to piece together what might be happening without ever really confirming it. And I rest easy knowing that just like real life, you don't always get to know everything. Spanning from religion to community roles, my upbringing has taught me temperance and a thirst for knowledge. And it's also taught me not to go wandering in the woods at night. My tabletop game What Happened trades heavily on ambiguity and inevitability. It's a missing persons horror story about an encroaching spiritual terror that is causing disappearances both supernatural and mundane. While it pulls my religious influences, it doesn't have the alien geometry and incomprehensible beasts cosmic horror that shows up in Lovecraftian and inspired works. Instead, I rely on more subtle ways to build tension and horror. Many spirits work in our world in subtle ways. Small nudges, tiny accidents, wonderful mistakes. Many spirits, but not all. I think for me, because I realize there's things bigger than myself and causes more important than just me in my life, inevitability lends itself well to my horror. Many indigenous upbringings place community above the individual, and this is reflected in What Happened as well. To save potentially lost members, players must sacrifice penny tokens. In order to gain an understanding of the horror and mystery, they must look beyond their own preconceived notions. In my environmental-based horror game, Los Arboles, the forest itself is the enemy. A hungry, sucking monster that wants to make you remember. Escape is based solely on chance. A reminder that inevitability can be your friend just as much as your foe. Looking at my belief systems, many belief systems of indigenous people, both modern and past, I see inevitability, community, cycles. Yes, death comes, and so does new life, even rebirth. I see this. H.P. Lovecraft barely scratched the surface of what we've been living for years. Inevitability is inevitable, but so is not knowing everything. And so we see within Indigenous storytelling of any kind, but especially in Indigenous horror, a cycle of the inevitable, the unknowable, the fact that you may never get all the answers, and you have to content yourself with that. A perfect balance. It's what makes Indigenous horror that much more compelling to me. I go in knowing I won't know, but I don't know what I won't know. I go in knowing I might lose, but I don't know how I'll lose. And most tantalizing of all, I go in knowing that I might survive. And so the question remains, what is cosmic horror from an Indigenous stance? Just our spirits and demons, our fears and experience superimposed over a groundwork laid by some unbaked dumpling like H.P. Lovecraft or Robert W. Chambers? I would argue no. I would argue that inevitability and encroachment have been part of the Indigenous experience since before Lovecraft and his ilk were sap in their father's rods. I would argue that things that move in the dark in ways both loud and subtle have been part of our stories since we first began keeping oral histories. And specifically, I would argue that my people have always known about the stars and the ocean and what lies beyond and within them. I would state that inevitability and ambiguity has always preyed upon our fears and our hopes. And I'm right to say it. The truth is that H.P. Lovecraft's success is a victim of timing. Perhaps his stories are compelling to some. I personally can't stomach the prose, but he laid a foundation that had, till then, been ignored, because inevitability and encroachment, as he told it, has only been told by people who white society didn't want to listen to or uplift. But we've always known about things bigger than us that don't care about us till they do. And I've used it to make compelling horror that explores identity, indigeneity, environment, and erasure in subtle ways. How can we succeed where H.P. Lovecraft failed? We go in knowing that we don't know. We go in knowing that there are equal chances of surviving, thriving even, and losing it all. We go in knowing that ambiguity and inevitability are a cycle that we fit so perfectly into. We succeed where HP failed because we are not built upon irrational fears of a white man who could barely leave his house because he was so afraid of immigrants and black people and brown people. We succeed where HP failed because we have faith where he had none. We have resilience where he trembled. And we have knowledge where he scrabbled for answers. And we respect the knowledge that we don't have. I still have a lot of horror under my skirt, and no, that's not a joke about me being trans. They'll come out one day soon, I hope. But the threads that pull at my hands are ever moving, so it is not given to me where I must wander. Or is it? We shall see. The only thing inevitable is death. somewhere, sometime, and a rebirth alongside it. At this time, before we start questions, I would like to draw attention to a few charitable causes. Both the Louisville Bail Fund and the Louisville Mutual Aid Fund are providing support to the disenfranchised and arrested protesters in Louisville, Kentucky, who are demanding a better state for us all. After the lack of indictment for the murder of Breonna Taylor, continued police violence, and police rioting, they need a lot of help. The Mutual Aid Disaster Relief Fund is channeling all of its donations right now to relief for Hurricanes Laura and Sally in the Gulf South. Lake Charles, Louisiana, is still struggling, and many parts of Florida and Louisiana are not getting the support they need from officials. Matter is providing support, and a little bit can go a long way, especially a little bit from many different people. Finally, I myself run a medic collective that offers medical support and hygiene products and aid to disaster victims, protesters, victims of state violence, and houseless folk. We're called the Mercy's Angels, and we rely exclusively upon donations of physical items or money to maintain our medic kits and continue providing aid to our houseless. If you have enjoyed today's video and you have a little extra something to spare, I would heavily encourage you to try and offer a little something to one of these charitable causes. Thank you very much, and I offer you many, many blessings. Now, let's chat.